Welcome to the English. On a bright summer morning in the small town of St. Petersburg, a boy named Tom Sawyer was nowhere to be found. His Aunt Polly, paced around the house, frustration clear on her face. She called out his name several times, but no answer came. Where could that boy be? She muttered under her breath, checking under the bed and behind the furniture. Just as she was about to give up, a small figure dashed past her. "There you are," she cried, grabbing him by the collar before he could escape. She glanced down at his pocket, noticing a suspicious bulge. "And what's that in your pocket, young man?" "Nothing, Aunt Polly," Tom answered quickly, but the half-eaten apple sticking out of his pocket said otherwise. Aunt Polly sighed. "Tom, those apples are not for you." Before she could scold him any further, Tom pointed behind her and gasped, "Aunt Polly, look, over there!" Out of instinct, she turned around. That was all Tom needed. He darted past her and out the door, disappearing into the sunlight. Aunt Polly let out a small laugh. "Oh, that boy! He's as slippery as an eel. I love him dearly, but he sure knows how to make life difficult for an old woman." The next day was Saturday, a day most children in town looked forward to, a day of adventure, laughter, and freedom. But for Tom, it was going to be anything but fun. Aunt Polly had a plan for him. "Tom, you're going to paint the fence today," she announced. Tom groaned as he stepped outside carrying a large bucket of white paint and a brush. His task was daunting. The fence stretched 3 meters high and 30 meters long. As he dipped the brush into the paint and made the first stroke, he sighed. This was going to take forever. After a few minutes, he put the brush down and stared at the fence in despair. There were still hours of work ahead, and he felt like the unhappiest boy in the world. But then an idea sparked in his mind, a brilliant idea. Tom picked up the brush again, this time painting with enthusiasm. He pretended to enjoy the work, brushing up and down with great care. Soon, his friend Joe Harper walked by, chewing on a juicy red apple. He stopped and watched Tom for a moment. "Tom, I feel sorry for you," Joe said, shaking his head. "You have to work while I'm off to the river." Tom smirked. "Work? Who said this is work?" He took a step back, admiring his brush strokes. "This is art. Not just anyone can paint a fence, you know." Joe narrowed his eyes. "It's just painting a fence, Tom." Tom shrugged. "Maybe, but my Aunt Polly only trusts me to do it. My brother Sid wanted to, but she said no. It takes real skill." Joe watched as Tom continued painting, carefully inspecting his work like a true artist. Curiosity grew inside him. "Hey, Tom," Joe said hesitantly. Do you think I could try?" Tom paused, as if considering it. "I don't know, Joe. It's kind of special work. I wouldn't want just anyone to do it." "Come on, just a little," Joe pleaded. "I'll even give you my apple." Tom hesitated, then sighed. "All right, but only because I like you." He handed Joe the brush, hiding his grin as he sat down in the shade, happily munching on Joe's apple. As the morning went on, more boys came by. At first they laughed at Tom, but when they saw Joe painting with such pride, they wanted a turn too. By the end of the afternoon, Tom hadn't painted a single extra stroke, yet the entire fence was beautifully white. In return for letting them help, he collected a treasure trove of items: 3 marbles, an old knife, a cat with one eye, and an old blue bottle. Tom leaned back with a satisfied smile. He had started the day as the most miserable boy in town, but now he was the richest and happiest. When Aunt Polly came out to check on his work, she was delighted. "Well, Tom, I must say, I didn't think you'd finish so quickly. You've done a wonderful job." She handed him an apple as a reward. Tom took it eagerly, and as he walked away, he sneakily grabbed a second apple before running off. His day had started with a punishment, but thanks to his cleverness, he had turned it into the best Saturday ever. Late at night, when the town of St. Petersburg was fast asleep, Tom Sawyer quietly climbed out of his bedroom window. The streets were dark and silent, and the only sound was the soft chirping of crickets. Tom tiptoed past his house and ran towards the old graveyard. His heart pounded with excitement. He loved adventures, and tonight was going to be a big one. When he reached the graveyard, Huckleberry Finn was already waiting for him. Huck was a boy who had no home, no school, and no rules. Most mothers in town didn't like him, but Tom thought he was the best friend a boy could have. "You made it," Huck whispered. "Of course," Tom grinned. "Did you bring the dead cat?" Huck nodded and held up a small, lifeless cat. "Old Mrs. Hopkins told me that if you bring a dead cat to a graveyard at midnight, it will call ghosts out of their graves." Tom shivered with excitement. "Let's wait and see." The graveyard was dark and spooky. The wind whistled through the trees, and the old wooden crosses cast long shadows. The two boys hid behind a big tombstone, waiting for something to happen. Suddenly, they heard footsteps. "Shh," Huck whispered. "Someone's coming." Tom held his breath. 3 shadowy figures walked into the graveyard. Tom and Huck's eyes widened in shock. "It's Injun Joe, Muff Potter, and Dr. Robinson," Tom whispered. They watched as the 3 men stood by a fresh grave. Dr. Robinson was young and well-dressed, while Muff Potter was an old, drunken man. Injun Joe, however, was the one who made Tom's skin crawl. He had dark, sharp eyes and a cold, dangerous smile. The boys stayed perfectly still. Muff Potter started digging up the grave. He and Injun Joe were working for Dr. Robinson, who had paid them to steal a dead body for medical experiments. After a while, the grave was open. Muff Potter wiped the sweat off his face. "All right, Doc," he said. "That'll be $5 more." Dr. Robinson crossed his arms. "I already paid you this morning. You're not getting any more money." Injun Joe stepped forward, his face dark with anger. "Oh, you think you're better than us, huh? You rich folks never remember the poor. 5 years ago I came to your house begging for food. You turned me away." Dr. Robinson shook his head. "That has nothing to do with this. You were a dangerous man then, and you still are now." That was the wrong thing to say. Injun Joe's eyes flashed with fury. He grabbed Dr. Robinson by the collar, but the doctor punched him in the face, sending him flying to the ground. Muff Potter, drunk and confused, jumped into the fight. He tackled the doctor, and the 2 men started punching and kicking each other. Then, everything happened in a blur. Dr. Robinson hit Muff Potter on the head with a heavy wooden board. Muff fell to the ground unconscious. At the same moment, Injun Joe grabbed Muff's knife, rushed forward, and stabbed Dr. Robinson in the back. The doctor let out a gasp, fell forward, and lay still. Tom and Huck watched in horror, their hands covering their mouths to stop from screaming. For a few seconds, there was silence. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind. Then Injun Joe smiled coldly. He looked down at Muff Potter, who was still lying on the ground, knocked out. Slowly, he placed the bloody knife in Muff's hand. Moments later, Muff opened his eyes. His face was pale. He sat up, looking at the dead doctor in shock. What happened?" he stammered. Injun Joe sighed and shook his head. "It's bad, Muff," he said. "You killed him." Muff's eyes went wide with terror. "Me? No, I don't remember anything. I must have had too much whiskey." Injun Joe patted his shoulder. "It's all right, Muff. I won't tell anyone. But you should leave town. Now." Muff stumbled to his feet and ran away into the night, shaking with fear. Injun Joe picked up the knife, wiped the handle clean, and carefully placed it next to Dr. Robinson's body. Then he walked away calmly, disappearing into the darkness. Tom and Huck sat frozen behind the tombstone, their hearts racing. Finally, Tom whispered, We have to tell someone. Huck shook his head violently. Are you crazy? If we tell, Injun Joe will kill us too. Tom swallowed hard. But Muff didn't do it. He's going to get blamed. I don't care, Huck said, his voice shaking. I'd rather be a coward than a dead man. Tom knew Huck was right. Injun Joe was dangerous. He could never know that they had seen everything. With one last look at the terrible scene, the two boys ran as fast as they could out of the graveyard. They didn't stop running until they were safely back in the village. But that night, as Tom lay in bed, he couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Injun Joe's face, the knife, and the terrible moment when Dr. Robinson fell. And he knew this secret would haunt him forever. For the next few days, Tom couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen in the graveyard. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Injun Joe's cold face, the knife, and Dr. Robinson falling to the ground. But the worst part? Muff Potter was in jail for a crime he didn't commit. Everyone in town believed Muff was the murderer. The sheriff had found him wandering near the graveyard, confused and smelling like whiskey. The bloody knife was there, and Muff himself couldn't remember anything. I must have done it, he whispered to himself in jail. Tom felt terrible. He wanted to tell the truth, but every time he thought about it, he heard Huck's voice in his head. If we tell, Injun Joe will kill us too. So Tom stayed quiet. But it wasn't easy. At night he tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. During the day he was distracted in school, getting into trouble even more than usual. Even Becky Thatcher, the prettiest girl in class, noticed something was wrong. Tom, she said one day, why are you so quiet? Are you sick? Tom just shook his head. No, I'm fine, he mumbled. But he wasn't. The only person who understood was Huck. One afternoon, they sat by the river, skipping stones. Huck, Tom finally said, I can't stand it anymore. Muff Potter didn't do anything. He's going to hang for this. Huck kicked a rock into the water. I know, Tom, but what can we do? Injun Joe would cut our throats if he found out we were there that night. Tom sighed. I just wish I could forget about it. Then he had an idea. What if we left, Huck? Tom said suddenly. Left? Huck frowned. Yeah, let's run away. Leave this town behind and go live like pirates. Huck's eyes lit up. Pirates? You mean out in the wild, sleeping under the stars, hunting for treasure? Exactly, Tom grinned. No school, no chores, no Aunt Polly, no problems. Huck nodded. That sounds real good, Tom, but where would we go? Tom thought for a moment. Jackson's Island. It's in the middle of the Mississippi River. Nobody lives there, and we can do whatever we want. Huck grinned. I like it. When do we leave? Tonight, Tom whispered. At midnight. Bring a fishing line, a knife, and some food if you can find any. Huck spit on his hand and held it out. It's a deal. Tom spit on his own hand and shook Huck's. The adventure was on. That night, 3 boys met by the river, Tom, Huck, and their friend Joe Harper. Joe had been mad at his mother, so he decided to join the adventure. The boys found a small wooden boat tied near the shore. Carefully, they climbed in and pushed off into the dark river. The Mississippi River was quiet, except for the soft sound of the water against the boat. The boys sat in silence, feeling excited and a little bit scared. Nobody will ever find us, Tom whispered. We'll live like kings. After about an hour, they reached Jackson's Island. It was dark and quiet, surrounded by tall trees and thick bushes. The boys pulled the boat onto the shore and ran up the sandy beach. This is our new home, Tom declared. They built a small fire using dry sticks and flint. The warm glow felt cozy, and soon the boys were laughing and eating. Joe had brought some bread and ham. Huck had a half-eaten piece of cheese. Tom had stolen some apples from Aunt Polly's kitchen. They ate like kings, feeling wild and free. "I ain't never going back," Huck said, stretching out on the grass. "Me neither," Joe agreed. Tom smiled up at the stars. "Tomorrow we'll explore the island. Maybe even find some treasure." The boys laughed, imagining their future as great pirates. The fire crackled softly as the boys lay back on the ground. They could hear the sound of the river, the chirping of crickets, and the distant call of an owl. But as the night went on, something changed. The excitement started to fade and a strange feeling settled in. Huck shifted. "It's real dark out here." Joe swallowed. "Yeah, it's kind of quiet too." Tom tried to ignore it, but deep inside he felt it too, a little bit of loneliness. No warm bed, no soft pillow, no home. But he shook off the thought. Pirates don't get scared, he reminded himself. The boys curled up near the fire, using their arms as pillows. Slowly, one by one, they fell asleep. For the first time in a long time, Tom wasn't thinking about Muff Potter or Injun Joe or the graveyard. All he dreamed about was adventure. For the first 2 days on Jackson's Island, Tom, Huck, and Joe felt like kings. They spent their time fishing, swimming, and exploring. They built huts from branches, cooked fish over an open fire, and pretended to be real pirates. But by the third day, something changed. Joe sat by the fire, staring at the flames. "I kind of miss home," he mumbled. Huck stayed quiet, but Tom knew he felt the same. At night, Tom lay awake, thinking about Aunt Polly. Was she worried? Did she think he was dead? And what about Muff Potter? He was still in jail, waiting for his trial. Tom couldn't take it anymore. That night, while the others slept, he got into the boat and paddled back to town. The streets of St. Petersburg were quiet and dark. Tom crept through the alleys until he reached his house. Carefully, he climbed through the window and hid behind a chair. Inside, Aunt Polly was crying. "Poor Tom," she sobbed. "I should have been kinder to him. I should have told him I loved him more." Tom's heart ached. Then he heard something that shocked him. The town believed the boys had drowned in the river. There was going to be a funeral for them on Sunday. Tom's eyes lit up with excitement. A funeral for them? What a glorious adventure. Suddenly, he had a wonderful idea. The next morning, Tom snuck back to the island. "Joe, Huck, wake up," he whispered excitedly. "What is it?" Joe yawned. Tom grinned. "We're going to crash our own funeral." Huck looked confused. "What do you mean?" Tom explained his plan, and soon all three boys were giggling with excitement. On Sunday morning, the entire town gathered at the church. The minister spoke about the brave young boys who were lost too soon. Aunt Polly and Joe's mother cried softly. Even Becky Thatcher had tears in her eyes. Then, at the perfect moment, the church doors creaked open. Gasps filled the room as Tom, Joe, and Huck walked down the aisle alive and well. For a moment, everyone was too shocked to speak. Then Aunt Polly ran forward and hugged Tom so tight he could barely breathe. The church erupted in laughter, cheers, and even more tears. It was the best funeral ever, but even after all the excitement, Tom couldn't forget about Muff Potter. His trial was set for the next day, and the whole town was ready to see him punished. In the small courthouse, people sat on wooden benches, whispering to each other. Tom and Huck hid at the back, their hearts pounding. The judge called witnesses. "I saw Muff Potter near the graveyard that night," one man said. "That's Muff's knife, he always carries it," another added. Muff Potter sat with his head down, looking old and tired. He believed he was guilty. Finally, the judge spoke. "Muff Potter, do you have anything to say?" Muff shook his head. "I don't remember what happened," he whispered. "I was too drunk." Tom's hands clenched into fists. This wasn't right. Then, without thinking, he stood up. "I know the truth," he shouted. Every head in the room turned to look at him. "Tom Sawyer, come forward," the judge said. Tom's legs shook as he walked to the front. He took a deep breath and began his story. "I was in the graveyard that night," he said, "and I saw everything." The courtroom fell silent. Tom's voice trembled, but he told the whole truth: how Muff Potter had been knocked out, how Injun Joe had taken the knife, and how he had stabbed Dr. Robinson. The judge leaned forward. "Are you saying Injun Joe is the real murderer?" "Yes, sir," Tom said. "It was Injun Joe." A loud gasp ran through the room. All eyes turned to Injun Joe, who had been sitting calmly in the corner. Suddenly he jumped up. With lightning speed, he ran to the window, smashed through the glass, and disappeared. By the time the sheriff reached the window, Injun Joe was gone. The judge banged his gavel. "Muff Potter, you are free to go." Tears filled Muff's eyes as he looked at Tom. "You saved my life, boy. I won't forget it." Tom felt lighter than ever. The truth was finally out. But deep down he knew one thing. Injun Joe was still out there, and he wasn't going to forget this. Saturday was a beautiful day. The sun was shining, the river sparkled, and the birds were singing. It was the perfect day for an adventure. Becky Thatcher and her friends were excited. They had planned a big picnic by the river, and everyone was coming, including Tom Sawyer. The children packed baskets full of bread, fruit, and cakes. Then they all climbed into a big boat and sailed down the Mississippi River, laughing and singing along the way. After eating, someone had an idea. "Let's explore McDougal's cave." The children cheered. McDougal's cave was big and dark, with hundreds of tunnels. Everyone in St. Petersburg had heard stories about it, some true, some just rumors. But no one really knew how deep it went. At first, the group stayed together, running through the tunnels, shouting and laughing as their voices echoed. They used candles to light their way, and they drew marks on the walls so they wouldn't get lost. But then something went wrong. Tom and Becky had been exploring a little too far. They found a narrow tunnel and followed it, giggling. "Come on," Tom said. "Let's go a little further." "Are you sure?" Becky asked, looking around. "Maybe we should go back." But Tom was curious. He wanted to see where the tunnel led, so they kept going. After a while, Becky stopped. "Tom, I don't hear the others anymore." Tom turned around. He listened. Silence. His stomach tightened. "Don't worry," he said quickly. "We can find our way back." They turned around and started walking back the way they came. But after a few minutes, Tom stopped suddenly. Something was wrong. The tunnel didn't look the same. The walls seemed different, and the air felt colder. Tom's heart started beating faster. "Tom," Becky whispered, her voice shaky. "Are we lost?" Tom didn't want to admit it, but deep inside he knew. "Maybe just a little," he said, trying to sound calm. "But don't worry, we'll find the way out." They walked and walked. They tried one tunnel, then another. But every tunnel looked the same. Becky was getting tired. Her feet hurt, and her candle was burning low. "Tom," she said weakly, "I'm so tired." Tom bit his lip. They had been walking for hours, and now they had a bigger problem. Their candles were almost gone. "We need to save the light," Tom said. "Blow out your candle. I'll keep mine on for a little longer." Becky shivered. The cave was cold and damp. They sat down next to a big rock, feeling small and scared. Tom held her hand. "It's going to be okay, Becky," he said softly. "They'll come looking for us." But deep inside, Tom wasn't sure. Would they ever be found? After resting for a while, Tom decided to explore. "Stay here, Becky," he whispered. "I'm going to look for a way out." Becky nodded weakly. She was too tired to move. Tom took a long piece of string from his pocket and tied one end to a rock. Holding the other end, he crawled into a small tunnel, using the string to find his way back. Slowly, carefully, he moved forward. Then, suddenly he froze. There was someone ahead. At first, Tom thought it was another lost child, but then, in the dim candlelight, he saw the face. His blood turned to ice. It was Injun Joe. For a second, Tom couldn't move. His legs felt like stone. Injun Joe's cold eyes scanned the tunnel. He was carrying something heavy, a bag of stolen treasure. Tom held his breath. Injun Joe took a few steps forward, looking around suspiciously. Then, after a moment, he turned and disappeared into the shadows. Tom waited until he was sure Injun Joe was gone. Then he crawled back as fast as he could. "Becky," he whispered. "Wake up." Becky's eyes fluttered open. "We have to keep moving," Tom said. "But why?" Becky asked. Tom didn't want to scare her. He just grabbed her hand and said, "Come on, I found something." They walked for what felt like forever. Then, just as their last candle flickered out, Tom saw something ahead. Light. "Becky, look!" he gasped. A tiny hole in the cave wall let in a sliver of daylight. Tom crawled forward, pushing against the rocks. Becky helped, digging with her hands. The hole was small, but just big enough. With one final push, Tom squeezed through. A second later, Becky followed. They tumbled onto the grass, blinking in the bright sunlight. They had made it out. Thank you for learning with the NGHE English.